The American people have turned against the Syrian refugees. We've got the polls to prove it, and the more unfortunate, more depressing part of this is that this is just the most recent example of what has become a fairly clear historical trend, a ribbon threading its way through the past 100 years of America's history when it comes to refugees, allowing in those who are dispossessed around the world, who are suffering in different parts of the world. So first, with the Syrian refugees, 56% of Americans disapprove of allowing refugees escaping violence to continue entering the U.S., whether from Syria or other nations. 41% of Americans feel that the U.S. should continue to allow in refugees. 11% say that only Christian refugees from Syria should be allowed to resettle in the U.S. So thankfully, that's from a different poll, by the way. There's been multiple polls, but that one is low at the very least. As you might suspect, this breaks pretty heavily along party lines. More than 8 in 10 Republicans are against letting in more refugees, many Christians in that group. Of those Republicans who oppose refugee entry, 64% strongly disapprove. So, geez, very few are ambivalent on it. Comparatively, 65% of Democrats approve of allowing refugees into the country. So they're still in favor of it. And let's bring up this chart because it's pretty interesting. It's showing just 1 month apart, September 2015, November 2015, the drop amongst all groups in support for allowing refugees fleeing war or oppression to enter in. I mean, you see a drop there, the Democrats even, but the Republicans, they had almost 40% approval, and now it's as popular as Bobby Jindal, basically. And that's all that remains after a month of demonizing the refugees, the terrorist attack in Paris, which was not perpetrated by Syrian refugees. That previous support for the refugees has evaporated.
It was 2 months, and yes, we've had more attacks since then.
Yes, 2 months technically.
Right, and the Russians lost a plane to ISIS. We understand all the events that have happened, but it is dispiriting, especially because none of those attacks were from Syrian refugees. In the case of Paris, they were all Europeans. They were Muslims, but they were born and raised in Europe, in Belgium, France, etc.
Yeah.
And ISIS attacked a Russian plane.
Or at the very least had lived there the vast majority of their lives. Like the guy who died in Paris had apparently been born in Morocco, but he grew up and lived in Europe.
Right. And so it wasn't a Syrian refugee that downed the Russian plane, right? It was ISIS, who the Syrian refugees are running from.
Yeah.
And so I can't get beyond what a great line Elizabeth Warren had, and this might be part of the reason why progressives are more open to it, and the fact that Republicans are generally unthinking about distinctions between the victims and the aggressors, where she said, "We are not a nation that returns children back to ISIS murderers." Right? See, now that's the correct distinction.
Yeah.
And that's a thinking person's distinction. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that happening in the country, especially among Republicans. But overall in the country, we're losing ground here. And I get it. It's not that people are getting dumber, right?
Yeah.
It's fear sets in, which is a normal human reaction.
Yeah.
And when fear sets in, rationality quickly exits thereafter, right? And so I don't know, but I don't want to risk it. I don't want to risk it, not in my backyard.
Yeah. And one of the most unfortunate things is, and I bring this up every once in a while, is one of the first things to go is our ability to analyze the probability of an event happening. Like, we become scared of scary seeming things that are so incredibly, monumentally, galactically unlikely to happen, but incredibly likely things like you might get in a car accident if you drink and drive. People aren't scared of that like they're scared of ISIS, and so they drink and they drive, and thousands die every single year in America. But a terrorist attack, something that is it's so incredibly unlikely to ever affect any individual, we will vote based on it. Every political action will be driven based on it. We don't rationally line up our fears based on an evaluation of reality.
So, and we're going to get into this now, to follow up on that, it's not just you're overly worried about terrorist attacks. I get why everybody's worried about terrorist attacks. I'm worried about terrorist attacks. I'm not irrationally worried about it, but I'm rationally worried about it, right? But the irrationality comes more into play when it comes to refugees.
Yeah.
So, for example, if back in 1938, 1939, you had said, well, those refugees which are predominantly Jewish coming in from Germany and other parts of Europe, I mean, they do look just like the Germans. They are coming from Germany. Some of them look just like the Germans, right?
Some of them consider themselves Germans.
Could some of them be Nazi spies?
Yeah.
Right?
And that was a fear.
That
so
was
why
a
don't
real
we talk
fear,
about those polls?
right? And so then people irrationally said, no, I don't want them in. I don't want any of them in, right? But what you did was monstrous because you sent them back to the Nazis
Yeah.
who killed a high percentage of them.
Yeah. So let's talk about those polls. Let's bring up this first one from July 1938. What is your attitude towards allowing German, Austrian, and other political refugees to come into the United States? You see there, they should encourage them to come 5%. We should allow them to come 18%. So there you get to about a quarter if you combine those. 10% aren't interested enough to figure out have an opinion. But with conditions as they are, we should try to keep them out. That's 67%. Now, this is 1938, very important time.
I want to be fair about this one. That poll happened before Kristallnacht.
Yes.
Okay. So now it's not like we didn't know that there was something wrong with how the Germans were treating the Jews at that point.
Yes.
We did know. These are almost all Jewish refugees. Still, over two-thirds of the country is saying, nah,
Yeah.
I don't think so, right? Now, the next poll is after Kristallnacht. It's abundantly clear for a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people.
It's pre-concentration camps. It's pre the true realization of the horrors of the Holocaust, obviously. But we had, and look, both of these follow years of continuing discrimination in terms of the law being barred from certain areas, being
But
barred
after
from certain
Kristallnacht,
fields.
you know they're burning down the temples
Exactly, yeah.
and seizing the property and starting
That's
to
true.
ship people off.
So let's go
okay?
to that one now. So this is January of 1939. It has been proposed to bring to this country 10,000 refugee children from Germany, specifically children, most of them Jewish, to be taken care of in American homes. Should the government permit these children to come in? 30% yes, 61% no to the 10,000 refugee children, and 9% still not interested enough to have an opinion on that.
So that's the one that's haunting because exactly like today, the number we're trying to bring in is exactly 10,000. Okay. Like today, when they're mostly Muslim, right? And when you mention mostly Muslim, people get skittish. Back then, when you mentioned mostly Jewish, people got skittish.
Yeah.
Although there were polls that said, even if they're not Jewish, I'm not interested. But if they were the polls that mentioned that they were Jewish, less people wanted to admit them in. You would think like, hey, wait, they want to help them more because they're trying to run from the Nazis? No, the anti-Semitism kicked in. We're like, more people said, no, not really. Yeah. Okay. So now you say, yeah, well, like, oof, it's a good thing we got past that anti-Semitism. Now we just hate the Muslims.
Yeah.
I think you missed the point.
Yes.
Right? So,
yeah, and look, we've seen the news. There's the St. Louis, the German cruise liner that had the 900 mostly Jewish people who were trying to get into America that was turned back. The people who were not allowed into the U.S. from that boat ended up going to several different countries. About 300 of them were eventually brought back into areas where there were Nazis, and they died. So out of the 900, 300, because we barred them, died to Nazi violence, or the bombings in Britain, one died to that. And look, this is obviously what we're focusing on, but this is throughout American history. I mean, we believe that Japanese immigrants during World War II were all spies, and so we rounded them up, and we had the internment. When the Cuban exiles started to come over, it was a fear that there were going to be communist spies amongst them. I mean, we always fear, for Mexican immigrants, we fear that they're drug dealers. There's always somebody to tell you to fear these weak people that are just desperately trying to have better lives. There's always going to be someone there to tell you that they're violent, that they're dangerous, you can't trust them. And unfortunately, in America, many of us are always going to be ready to bow down to that fear, to that fear, and to forget what's supposed to make us better than other countries.
And to that point, another part of that poll was their children, right? And now we have people like Chris Christie saying, I don't care if they're 3-year-olds or 5-year-olds.
Yeah.
If they're Muslim refugees coming in from Syria, no. The answer is no, I'm not going to let them in.
Yeah.
It is absolutely haunting. And I read more about the SS St. Louis. That was the cruise liner with the Jewish exiles from Europe trying to get into Cuba first, then Florida.
Yeah.
Right. And when they got to Florida, they were rejected because they couldn't trust them. Better safe than sorry, people thought, than to let these European Jewish immigrants into the country in the middle of a war that they were having. And Gisela Feldman was on that cruise. She's 90 when this article was written. She was 15 at the time. And she talks about how her dad was taken away by the Nazis, and he was killed. And she said goodbye before she got on the cruise liner to 30 family members, relatives, all killed by the Nazis, right? So now, I mean, I just had an Uber driver yesterday in San Francisco when I was up there. Her name is Zara. She's from Afghanistan. Her father was killed by the Taliban. She's trying to get her family in. Now, it's not Syrian refugees, but it is refugees from Afghanistan who were fighting on our side. She was her father was a commander in the Afghan army who we support, right? She can't even get her family in yet because we're not quite sure. She's like, the Taliban killed my father, right? They're killing my family. Can you help us? The answer's got to be yes.